Right, can we move now as a council to the submission on proposed block offer 2017, item 9 on your agenda, and could we have staff at the end of the table? This is because this is a brand new council, could staff introduce themselves when they come to the table? That would be great.
Good morning, I'm Helen Beaumont, Head of Strategic Policy.
And I'm Diane Shalander. I'm in the Natural Environment team in Helen's unit.
And we do have a couple of updates to the paper, if you'd like us just to touch on those before we start.
Yes, one is regards the Paris Agreement that was recently ratified. It was ratified after the paper was submitted for this council meeting. And just a suggestion that might want to be included in the submission. In particular, the national targets for the medium and long term, 30% below the 2005 submissions by 2030, 11% below 1990 by 2030, and 50% below 1990 by 2050. And the government proposes to meet these targets through a mixture of domestic emission reductions, forest planting, and participation in international carbon markets. So that was one. The other was mentioned in the first deputation, and that is the MFE report on our marine environment 2016. And again, this came out just last week, and it was after this paper was submitted. In particular, in that report, there were a couple of things of interest that were not in the submission that relates to exploration and extraction, and this had to do with sediment plumes and the extraction process. What the report says, and I'm just reading part of it, the burning of fossil fuels is a major cause of anthropogenic global warming and ocean acidification. On a local scale, the extraction of fossil fuels such as oil and gas from ocean-based wells can have environmental impacts. Oil and gas extraction can adversely affect the marine environment, although the effects are localized. Potential sites for mineral extraction are being surveyed and explored. Sediment plumes produced by the extraction process can affect an extensive area as the suspended sediment spreads. The plumes reduce food availability for some species, smother seabed species such as corals, and reduce light availability for photosynthesis. Discharge of tailings, which are residues from extraction, and effluent can harm plankton and fish species. And this is direct from the report that MFE released last week.
So you're suggesting that that be included in the submission?
That's correct.
Yeah. Very good. Does anyone have any questions? Pauline and then Phil.
On that last one, the
Sarah.
sediment plumes, can you explain what they are?
Well, it's
And how they produce?
I'm assuming it's as part of the drilling into the seabed. The report itself doesn't go into detail, so I'm just making some assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah, Phil and then Sarah.
Diane, can I ask you, there's been some discussion about how long it might take to if in the event of a oil spill, to actually fix that or plug it. But I note in your report a comment from Dane Maxwell really saying that in fact internationally there isn't actually equipment available which would deal with any spill because of the depth of our ocean and the roughness of the ocean. I just wonder if you might comment on that.
Yeah, I would certainly expect him to have more knowledge than me on the matter. Yeah, the challenge is because of the depth that some of these wells would be exploration wells or production wells would be placed in around our coast. It's a much more challenging environment than most of the other places where oil is extracted. And even where the equipment does exist, it actually will take some time for that equipment to get to where it is, and the closest location is Singapore. To get to New Zealand, get placed, get set up, and actually start to mitigate, for example, a a blowout in a well. So there's quite a bit of time involved in just getting the equipment, and the reason for that is that equipment is quite specialized, it's extremely expensive, and the country does not have the resources really to try to build its own to have on hand, which is why we have international agreements with those that do have the equipment. So even where the equipment is available, there's still that risk in terms of the time it takes to get the equipment on site.
Sarah and then Glenn. Oh, same question? Excellent. Good thing. Glenn, doesn't stop everyone.
Right. Thank you, Diane. You mentioned the Paris Agreement. Can you recall in the Rio Earth Summit back in 1990 how high petroleum exploration featured in terms of conversations around climate change at that time? Was that?
Oh, I might defer to Helen on that. I
Sure.
don't recall.
Okay.
It's fair to say that it has been on the agenda, on the international agenda for discussion for several decades. The Paris Agreement perhaps indicates more willingness to actually take action rather than talk about it.
Okay, so potentially reaching back prior to Rio in 1990, 26 years ago. Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions? Yanni?
Thank you. I was interested in the division around the Paris Agreement. Have we received anything as a council from central government around what the ratification of that agreement means for us?
There's a lot of information on the Ministry for the Environment's website around what the ratification of the agreement means, but it is a national set of targets and commitments rather than specific targets that are rolled down to local government. And the primary mechanism by which local government will see those will be through changes to the economy with the rollout of the emissions trading scheme. So the emissions trading scheme is being reviewed and potentially expanded into sectors that have previously been excluded. And it's also being reviewed in terms of ensuring that the price of carbon isn't undermined by changes in the international market. So it's the emissions trading scheme that will change things across the country rather than a specific direction and targets for local government.
Just following on from that, because it's certainly our intention to sign the Compact of Mayors when we are in a position to do so. So in terms of I always worry about this idea that all these frameworks are government to government when actually it's city to city that you can make the most difference and you can actually achieve the outcomes that actually a country can't achieve on its own, not unless it's got all its cities on board. So would that be a better response to the question around, whether the government's written to us telling us what we should be doing as a result, we should be writing to the government and telling them what we're doing to actually implement our obligations?
Yeah, agreed. And the Compact of Mayors is indeed a way that Christchurch can show that leadership as a city and a commitment to that transition to a lower carbon economy, both from how the council behaves but also how it provides incentives to the business community to behave.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So now, Vicky, you've got an amendment to it. So before I open it up for debate, we'll just because I think there's a certain direction that we'd like this to go. So, right, it's just big type. So essentially, do you want to just speak to what you're proposing?
I'll do my part of the debate as well.
Well, you can move it then.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll move that the council strengthen its position so that it states clearly its implacable opposition to oil drilling off the coast of Canterbury and actually anywhere else. That it asks ECAN to also submit and target.
Sorry, I'll move. that the council submission is adopted, but that it's actually strengthened because I just feel we're being slightly polite on something that we really don't want to be polite on.
This is, and so that what I'm suggesting is that we strengthen our position so that we state our implacable opposition to oil drilling off the Canterbury coast, that we ask ECAN, who at the moment have not yet made a submission, as I understand it, to also submit, and also ask Ngāi Tahu, who are the only other people, iwi and hapu, who are allowed to, and that we delegate to a committee of Pauline, Sarah, Tim and I to actually strengthen this in time. It will still state all of the same things that are in there, but it will just have a very clear message that this is not what we want from Christchurch. And the reasons for that, I think, were covered incredibly well by Siana and Paul, and by many others. The whole thing of this is complete environmental and economic lunacy, and we cannot, for a moment, think that this makes any sense. Even economically, even if we could put the environment aside for a moment, even economically, we make our living off agriculture, horticulture and tourism. All of those things depend on our clean green, almost, or not, image, but at least the image is there. If we destroy that, we actually destroy the economy of Canterbury. We've seen that what happens in a disaster. In this case, the oil companies apparently have unlimited liability, and I can imagine as an oil company how they've limited that. We have no capacity as a country to deal with an oil spill. If you've seen the Deepwater Horizon movie, even though it's a movie, what happened there was days and days and weeks and months of oil spilling in and spilling out. And that, it just cannot be. This is in deep water alongside a marine mammal reserve, a marine sanctuary. The oil doesn't know that the sanctuary starts there, and even if it did, the risks associated with this are just too revolting to even contemplate. We cannot, as we understand it, refine any of the oil in New Zealand. So even if the argument were that we could become independent in terms of oil, it makes no sense. It actually is not true, and we know that there are sufficient reserves of oil that the world cannot process, cannot use if it actually wants to keep this planet livable. So this to me is like a nightmare scenario, that people would come in and think that our coastline, our water, that is so much a part of us, was somehow for sale to oil companies to come and do what they want, with none of us having the capacity to actually deal with any of the consequences. It is complete environmental and economic lunacy, and I cannot believe that a government that has ratified the Paris Agreement, that comes into effect on November the 4th, that the world has adopted, and that we are going to be part of a major climate change strategy, is even contemplating drilling for this oil. It is lunacy. There is no other word for it. So I'm happy to move.
Sarah, would you like to second that? Are there any speakers? Yanni, Glenn, Phil? Oh, right, I'll get to you. I need a pen.
Can I say I totally support the resolutions that have been amended. I think it's really important that we make very strong reference to our opposition. To me, it's really simple. The exploitation of our earth for economic profits at the expense of our environment is short-sighted, is fiscally irresponsible, and is morally wrong. It is totally unacceptable. Sadly, what we know with this government, it's a strong supporter of asset sales, and it has and will continue selling off our most valuable and yet most vulnerable asset, which is our environment. It has no shame in privatising the benefits of doing so, while at the same time making us as a city and a region inherit unfairly the ongoing liabilities, risks and consequences. And the hypocrisy of this, it is doing this with little to no democracy over the decision making in this regard. It excludes the public from making submissions and ignores those who selectively requests it to participate. So this is like deja vu. Every year we put a submission opposing it. Every year the government keep saying we're going to go out and do more. I think that's really sad. It's sad because in Christchurch and Canterbury, it's been a common theme even before the earthquake, where our basic human rights to participate in the things that affect us and future generations have been taken away by those in the beehive, simply because we as a city and as a region believe in enhancing and protecting our environment rather than exploiting it. Look at the sacking of Ecan over water. I think that this submission is really important, that we are very strong worded in terms of what we say. The current course of action is of great concern by this government. The cost to our city and our country, not if, but when something goes wrong, will be horribly expensive and long-lasting. It is simply unacceptable to put our future at risk with activities that harm and hurt rather than help and nurture our planet. So I would encourage everyone around this table today to make a very strong stance in support of the representations we've heard from the community. I thank those people, those citizens that have taken the opportunity to come and talk to us today, but also the citizens who have made ongoing efforts to raise this in terms of public attention and public awareness. It is a critical issue, and it would be great to send a unanimous signal to government that we are totally opposed to what they're suggesting.
Phil, Glenn, then Andrew.
Thank you, and I want to thank our staff for an excellent report and for the people, the citizens who've made such excellent submissions today. I think it's a really sad irony, actually, that while we're discussing this issue about reducing carbon emissions, that, as we've been told, New Zealand is not only a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which, although it's been ratified, but I think it actually comes into effect this coming Friday. And there's what a huge contradiction, as Yanni has indicated, and Vicky too, how our central government have signed up to the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions, and at the same time, the government wants to exploit fossil fuels on our seashores. So it's really important, actually, given the lack of democracy in this, that our council exercise our authority as citizens, and the leverage that we have as we're able to make a submission. And I strongly support the recommendation around where there is that absence of public consultation and implicitly democracy. Because clearly the oil companies, they all have their say, but there's no chance for ordinary citizens to even speak up about this. So I'm glad people have made their submissions today. And we know from the evidence that the oil drilling, certainly there is the potential for an accidental spill. There's history to that. And the clear harm to our marine life and our coastal seabirds, and all that, as well as the human impact in terms of the potential loss of our tourism. So, and like the wonderful asset that we do have with the Banks Peninsula Marine Sanctuary, we should be extending this. It shouldn't be, the marine sanctuary shouldn't be threatened with its extinction. So, and there is the question too, and it's in the report, around what insurance would we have. And I think the section 3.3 refers to the oil companies having unlimited liability. But the report also raises the question about how can you put a monetary value on the impact of a major oil spill. Because, and the report is really clear, although the probability may not be high, in fact the consequences and the impact of an oil spill, in the words of the report, could be catastrophic. So I feel very strongly about this. I think it's really important that as a council we exercise our decision today in a sensible way. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few points which I'm going to frame as rhetorical questions. The first of which is, how does the use of fossil fuels actually line up with our approach over future energy consumption? The second, what is sustainable about drilling for oil, even if the risks were put aside? My third point, it's been more than 26 years since that Earth Summit in Rio, and as Helen has indicated, and Diane as well, these conversations over sustainability and climate change have actually been going on for decades. We're pretty out of step. Fourthly, there is another disconnect. We've talked about, on the one hand, signing the Paris Agreement, and on the other, pursuing this block offer. There's at least another, that the government or this administration conferred marine sanctuary status in one part of our district and now wants to pursue drilling for oil in that same district. There's a real disconnect inside the administration, and I think there are inconsistencies throughout their whole worldview. They just can't have it both ways. So I urge your full support on this. In rugby league terms, when you hit back strongly, they call it the big don't argue, and I think we should do that today. And as Vicky has said, absolutely strengthen our position, stating clearly our implacable opposition to this. Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking staff who have worked on the submission, and also thanking the people that have come along to speak to us today as well. It's unfortunate that this is the only opportunity to make a stand on this, and I think it's great that the opportunity has been taken to speak with us today. I'm in agreement with the submission and its content. I'm certainly in agreement with that submission being strengthened so that we send as unequivocal and strong a message as we possibly can that what's proposed here is unacceptable, and I've got total confidence in the small group that we're intending to or proposing to delegate approval to do that too. I would draw Councillors' particular attention to paragraphs 3.1 to 3.21 in the submission. That's the part of the submission that specifically refers to the Banks Peninsula Marine Mammal Sanctuary, in including the list at 3.18 of the Banks Peninsula flora and fauna which could be put at risk by this activity. It's absolutely absurd that this type of activity could even be countenanced, let alone proposed to be allowed, in a marine mammal sanctuary. The Hector's dolphin is possibly the most obvious of the endangered species that we're putting at risk here, or that are proposed to be put at risk. The sanctuary is valuable, not only in terms of its environmental values, but also its social values. And it was mentioned earlier that we're here as representatives of our communities. We're also here as representatives of the whole city. I don't doubt for 1 minute that the people of Banks Peninsula would support us agreeing to anything that put that amazing natural environment and everything that not only the people of the peninsula but the people of the city love about that natural environment of Banks Peninsula and its beaches and its coastal environment. I don't believe the people of the peninsula would support us putting that at risk, and I don't believe the people of the city would support us putting that very special landscape and that very special environment at risk. So I support the submission. I support it being strengthened as much as it possibly can be, and any additional information being put in there that supports the submission and strengthens it. I take a strong position of opposition to this block offer, and I encourage my colleagues around the table to do the same.
Very good. David and then Sarah.
I'm going to be the renegade of the party. I'm not at all supportive of, I've got 3 main points to raise here. Firstly, I'm not at all supportive of political parties and activist groups using the City Council as a platform for promoting a political viewpoint. An earlier speaker said we should have a special consultative process to ensure that we are representing the view of the city, and I'm totally in support of that sort of approach and just not reporting the view of a vocal minority of our, vocal section of our community. Secondly, I consider this as a bit of an alarmist position, and the probabilities are extremely low, and certainly climate change, in my opinion, is very cyclical and has been occurring for millenniums. I would have liked to have asked one of the earlier speakers how he would have reconciled the fact that geological and fossil evidence substantiates that the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere was greater in Roman times than it is now. I believe there's probably more chance of a supertanker crisis off the coast than there would be a mishap offshore. At present time, rightly or wrongly, we are reliant on fossil fuels for a huge part of the world economy, and New Zealand's independence from the variances of crude oil prices would be a great advantage to our economy. Vicky made reference earlier to Canterbury being an economy that's totally reliant on agriculture, tourism and a couple of other things I can't recall, but those things are all totally reliant on fossil fuels to generate the income that they do. And thirdly, I think this is probably the most important point in my mind. Disruptive technology, I believe, will in a relatively short time substantially remove the reliance of fossil fuels and negate the issues that a lot of people are talking about. The huge advances that we're now seeing in solar energy, battery storage, and a lot of other energy innovations will substantively reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, I believe, in a very short span of time. I also believe that we're on the verge of a new technological age that will radically change our energy options. So, in summary, I believe this is not core business for Council. Technological advances will in all probability make offshore drilling in New Zealand uneconomic, and utilising Council time on these matters, in my opinion, is unnecessary and unproductive. So I will not be supporting the resolution.
Sarah.
Thank you. I'm really happy to support this and really looking forward to strengthening our proposal, both in the way of objecting to the block offer off the Canterbury coast, where it will have both environmental and economic impacts. They have impacts broader than just Canterbury, though. Anything that happens to us happens to the country. Our image and reputation is damaged, spills spread a long way, and also the climate change impacts are felt not just locally but globally. The same goes for oil drilling anywhere in New Zealand, and I'd like to see us strengthen it to object to all of the block offers, because whatever happens to any other part of the country, should there be a spill and their emissions from climate change, happens to us as well. And it impacts the image of the whole country, and that impacts us. So I'd like us to not just oppose the ones off the Canterbury coast, but actually nationally. And I know that, Vicky, you mentioned that briefly in your earlier comments as well. There is one thing I did agree with David on, and that was the fact that these new technologies are going to actually stop our reliance on fossil fuels. We don't even need these oil explorations, and it's a folly to continue with them. So happy to support.
Aaron?
Most of what could be said has been said today, and I applaud David in his pointing out of why we shouldn't support drilling off the coast in his roundabout way. That was a good way of talking us out of it, David. Thank you. And Sarah points out the technological advances as well, as did David. But I did watch a program late last night on BBC World where they were making electric cars in China using so much coal to fuel the plants to do it, that the amount of carbon that you would save by using an electric vehicle versus a petrol vehicle was negated by the coal you burnt to get to making that vehicle. So let's be careful which road we go down to get there. And speaking of roads, this will be the one question I would ask my fellow council members before we support this, which no doubt it will be pretty well supported, with the exception of one, I believe, and that is, I don't believe submissions actually go that far to talk the government into changing their mind, but actions speak louder than words, and how many biked or walked to council today or this week or will intend to do so, because actions speak louder than submissions. Congratulations, Mike. Oh, great, 3, quarter.
Very good. Are there any other, Pauline?
Thank you. Look, I fully support this. I believe it is council core business. In the report in number 2, the Local Government Act 2002 states that in performing its role, a local authority must act in accordance with the following principles. And taking a sustainable development approach, a local authority should take into account the social, economic and cultural interests of people and communities, and the need to maintain and enhance the quality of the environment and the reasonable foreseeable needs of future generations. So we've heard the risks to the environment. It's our duty at local government level to protect that, and as far as the foreseeable needs of future generations, I think we can see the way forward that we're not going to be needing the oil. So I will be supporting this.
All right, I shall put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Please report, David. Thank you all, and thanks very much to those that came and presented to us. I think that was incredibly good, and this is a way of putting these things into the public arena and having that public conversation that otherwise we wouldn't be able to have. So thank you very much. Could I now call Keep Our Assets to the table? So, Murray Horton and Brian Turner, welcome.
Thank you.
Right, good morning.
Good morning.
I would say for Councillor Kewen's benefit, I did bike here this morning, but then I bike everywhere, so thank you very much. Good morning, my name's Murray Horton. This is the Reverend Brian Turner, who's here as my spiritual advisor this morning, in case I go off message. Representing Keep Our Assets, Canterbury. We did not ask for a deputation to this meeting because we felt that our position was perfectly clear on this issue, but we did actually this morning receive an invitation from the Mayor to actually make a deputation here. We've had no chance whatsoever to prepare anything, so I've scribbled some notes on an envelope, and my only problem now is trying to read my handwriting. Our title is self-explanatory. It's what it says on the shirt. So, Keep Our Assets. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. To sum it up, we want the whole issue of asset sales taken off the agenda of the Christchurch City Council, full stop. Completely removed. Not just picking here and there. I realise that what you're specifically talking about today on the supplementary agenda paper is a vote to put Enable and City Care to be restored onto the strategic assets list. We think once again this is glaringly obvious that those assets should be put back onto that list, should be restored to that list. They are both in fact vital parts of the infrastructure, not only of Christchurch but of any modern city. As you're fully aware that we campaigned for something like 18 months against the proposed sale of City Care. I'd like to congratulate the council for whatever reason for deciding not to do so. This is our first opportunity to do that. We said at the time, and we say it again here now, for example, that City Care to be selling off or even have the possibility of selling off an infrastructure and maintenance company, the equivalent at the local level of the good old Ministry of Works, at a time when the city is undergoing the biggest rebuild in New Zealand history, would be madness to actually let that fall into private hands. Enable broadband infrastructure is the digital future of not only Christchurch but of the nation. It was a very wise move for the council to get into that. So City Care represents physical infrastructure, Enable represents digital infrastructure. Both of them should be restored onto the strategic assets list. And while we're at it, Red Bus should also be put back onto the strategic assets list. And I would agree, we would agree with the Mayor, who said in various campaign meetings that she wanted Christchurch to have control back over the buses. We fully agree on that it should be taken away from ECAN, and Christchurch should be controlling its buses again, and those buses should remain in public ownership, and they should be on strategic asset list. Having actually read the supplementary agenda for today, I note that there was no actual public consultation on removing Enable from the strategic assets list before that was done in 2015. But one of the options put in front of you here today is that maybe the public should have to be consulted before it is indeed restored. We would urge that you adopt the option in the supplementary agenda paper of simply voting today to restore Enable to the strategic assets list. And it's also worth re-emphasising the point that being on that list does not in itself protect assets from sale. It simply means that they have to go through, in the case of, what is it now, Orion, Littleton Port Company, Christchurch Airport Company, and apparently Eco Central, they have to go through some kind of public consultation process before they're being sold. I used to work for the railways in the 1980s, so I have personal experience of quote-unquote being consulted before major decisions have been made. I mean, I see some knowing smiles around the table, and we've been through the consultation stuff in the 80s and 90s. I know what it feels like. We were told what was going to happen. You've been consulted. Thanks very much. Goodbye. The other point we would like to make, we're very pleased that the discussions here today on Enable and City Care have been removed from the public excluded section of your meeting and restored to this public section. We think that decisions on any potential asset sale should be made in open session, not in public excluded sessions. That we believe that the council should function as a parliament, not as a board of directors of a private company, that you in fact are our public servants. Let's have an open government ethos. Let's have a public service ethos restored to the Christchurch City Council. That open government is fundamental to democracy, and we believe that democracy is our greatest asset. To conclude, so what should the council do? Instead of selling assets, well, you're doing it right for a start. The press all over the front page quite recently, within the last couple of weeks, highlighted that you are in fact deferring and delaying major expenditure already on some projects. That's one way. We've recommended that for a long time. And the second thing is renegotiate the cost share agreement and abandon some of these ghastly white elephants, such as the proposed covered rugby stadium. I speak as a rugby fan who went to the final on Saturday night in Addington. I'm very pleased the stadium's in Addington. I live in Addington. I walk to and from the games. It's very handy that it's there. That's perfectly sufficient. Abandon that white elephant. Note the fact that the biggest event in New Zealand rugby history, the British Lions tour happening in 2017, the All Blacks for the first time in 100 years are not going to be playing any games anywhere in the South Island. They're playing 2 in Auckland and 1 in Wellington. The rugby union, which controls this, said they wouldn't come to Christchurch because the city's buggered and can't handle the barmy army of Pommy fans, but they also said they're not going to go to Dunedin, which has the country's most modern covered stadium and most expensive. Why? Because they said Dunedin's not big enough to handle it. So effectively what we have here is a problem of not Auckland syndrome. So forget about things like rugby stadiums and that, and $253 million for that. Renegotiate that cost share agreement with the government, and I'll conclude by saying, as it says on the shirt, keep our assets. Thank you very much.
Just one question in relation to Enable. Yep. Did you feel that during the consultation process that we went through in 2015 to 2020 on the 2015-25 long-term plan, that there was any indication that we would be looking at its location on the strategic assets list, because we weren't contemplating selling any shares in it? I mean, it just occurred to me that perhaps that was potentially, that people would have felt that they hadn't really been consulted on it coming off the strategic assets list, because we weren't consulting on selling any shares in it.
I think the impression that we had, and certainly other people have had, was that it being removed from that list sort of slipped through unnoticed. I mean, I just wondered if it had anything to do with the proposal, which says it is not proposed to explore market opportunities at this time to sell any interest in Enable Services Limited to provide part of the council's objective to achieve a realisation of capital, and at that time up to $750 million. Consideration of a sale may be given after 2021, when the network is fully built, a release from contractual obligations to the government is negotiated, and if the council's need for capital still remains.
but the release from contractual obligations to the government in some elements is resolved because we've now bought out the government, but we still have contractual obligations in terms of the delivery of the ultra-fast broadband. But I just wondered whether one of the I'm actually being helpful here, I think, is that perhaps the public didn't realise that we would look at taking it off the strategic assets list when we made it abundantly clear that we wouldn't even consider selling any shares in it until 2021 when the network was fully built.
As I understand it, the purpose of the strategic assets list is to provide an extra level of protection for things that are deemed to be strategic. And so by removing...
No, it just has a consultation requirement.
Well, okay.
So it's
a one more step.
No. It's the same step, but it's called it's called a special consultative procedure, but it is all it means is that you have a special consultative procedure as opposed to an appropriate level of consultation, which is required under the Act anyway. So it actually makes very little difference just to the nature of consultation. But what I'm trying to gather from you is whether you, because we weren't actually going out there to say that we were going to sell any shares. I mean, in other instances with CityCare, we said that no further public consultation would be required. So that's so people wouldn't have been surprised that we put that out for sale. But they would have been surprised about Enable, because Enable wasn't up for sale at all. None of the shares were.
As I say, I repeat the point that by it being removed from that list, it gives the impression at least of being in a position where it can be sold without consultation. That's the public understanding.
Yeah, it certainly was made clear in relation to certain assets, but not Enable, which I think is a justification for putting it straight back on the list today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Glenn?
I guess I would echo that, just that two-step process about how clear that was. So yes, we consulted on selling them, but the mechanism by which to remove them, how...
No. I think if you actually look at the... But anyway, we'll deal with that when we get to the paper, because we're going to get to the paper right now. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
And thank you for taking up the offer of coming too, because I really did want to make the point. This is a new council. This isn't the council that was here before. We'd like to develop a strong working relationship with all of the groups that care about our city. Every single person stood for council because they care about our city. And we know that at the heart of what you stand for is about caring for our city too. So we want to develop a strong working relationship. So thank you very much for taking up the offer.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm just wondering whether we should break for a quick cup of tea. Yep. And then we'll come back to, and somebody can go and get me a coffee. Okay, so we'll reconvene at say 25 past. That's 15 minutes. Thank you.